Hi and welcome to Generous Theology. In this episode, Chuck and Brock examine material from Robert Pasnau's Chapter 26, Science and Certainty, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Great points. It is such a complicated situation, and yet in the ideas of the continuum between essentialism and existentialism, there's that one clear gradient, and that comes down to self versus something out there, with the something out there from all practical perspective being God, a theistic conception. And I think the one big thing that I would like to contrast the medieval essentialistic position with is the idea, the sneaking suspicion that I have, and I think this is an arguable thesis. I don't think I could prove this in a court of law or scientifically, but I have a sneaking suspicion that something called scientism is really at the root of everything associated with what modern conceptions and views of reality have become. And just basically, scientism is the view that science is the best or only objective means by which society should determine normative and epistemological values. And so I was just speaking with somebody yesterday, and they said to me, if you don't have scientific proof about God, you've got nothing. And that's one of the hallmark phrases of this sort of new secular religion. And I'm really exploring and toying with the idea of saying that in this new secular enlightenment, this scientism, we have an atheistic expression of religion. And so this idea, this view that science is the best or the only objective means by which society determines normative values or even epistemological, how we know. Question, can you prove that scientifically? Does science give us what's normative? No, science has never given us what is normative. It's only given us observations regarding what is. And so why questions? Teleos-based, purpose-based questions. Very difficult for observational science to speak into. And in fact, this all goes back to the idea of meaning versus what the data shows. So sometimes you'll hear people say, I just want to look at the facts. And there's nothing wrong with the facts, but we manage to slip narrative in with those facts. And those narrative themes represent extra scientific material. And this is where the medievals are going to be so refreshing and where moderns and postmoderns are going to be such a letdown. This sort of weaponization of science, this idea that science can support some of the things like, for example, contemporary critical theory methods. It's just a mess. And of course, you have other expressions of this in the philosophy of science. You have things like logical positivism. Folks like Friedrich Hayek, Karl Popper, and others have this dogmatic scientific methodology that seeks to reduce knowledge to only that which is measurable or confirmatory. We have the improper usage of science or scientific claims. Think here about the weaponization of science in public policy discussions. Think of the bite behind being called a science denier in 21st century life for having a different perspective, a different ethical perspective on some of the observed trends and some of the things that are happening in society. Now, this idea as well that natural methods, science, natural science, and the categories associated with natural science form the only proper elements in philosophical inquiry. That other aspect there, that's another tentacle of scientism. Since when, who died and made the naturalistic part of reality the most important part? The answer is simple. This is a direct outgrowth of the death of God movement. In the essentialism of earlier time periods, including the medieval period, it was just simply a starting point that there was an external purpose to reality that came from outside of the human person and had a moral fiat, had a moral authority over him. And now, of course, we have this idea now that people answer to no one but themselves. People generate their own meaning, they generate their own ethics and values. And in fact, we have all of these traditional categories called into question. Is there even such a thing as the mind? So today, for example, there's a philosophical science called eliminative materialism. And so there are philosophers such as Alexander Rosenberg, and he has this idea that is extremely scientistic. There is, in fact, no non-corporeal conceptions, no objects. Human beings might possess a brain, he might say, but not a mind. And the distinction there is crucial because he means to limit the human cognitive faculty to the physical. And so we see here, imagine taking Plato's cave and turning it upside down on its head to where people say, no, it is only those shadows being projected on the wall of the cave that are truly real. And anything outside of that, by definition, is not real. And so you see that sort of negative space, that inversion, that upside downedness that existentialism brings in. And scientism is this focus. And Chuck, I apologize here for rambling, but I really see all the aspects of a religion here. And I know it upsets so many of my naturalistic friends. They're very upset that I would equate what it is they do with the bad things that they think I do, being dogmatic, having faith, all of those kinds of things that they feel they're above. And yet that's exactly the excess that I see here. And so we're going to see, I think, in this chapter, we're going to see that the medievals are not just simply old thinkers outmatched and outclassed. But I think we're going to see that these older thinkers are quite perceptive, they're quite insightful, and they have something to say, and it is from a specific perspective. And just ignoring that perspective is not going to be, I don't think that's going to be tenable or good in the long run. So that was a long introduction, and we didn't get into what the medievals thought, but we hopefully laid some of the backstory there. Can I just throw it over to you for some last ideas for this session?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I think for our listeners and the people who are watching the videos, one place that I think might be a useful place for people to go, think about some of the concepts we've been talking about. There's an excellent book by Roy Clauser called The Myth of Religious Neutrality. And he deals with this idea that you've touched on as well, that there isn't such a thing as religious neutrality. And in fact, so many ways of thinking are religious systems of thinking. People think they're not. They think that science, especially, is something separate from religion, but there is this real tie here. And the scientific method and empiricism and those kinds of things can become as much a religious system as any kind of theistic religious. And so that might be a good place for people to go who are interested further in some of the concepts that we've been talking about today. The other thing, just as you were speaking, and especially in the first little bit of your discussion, it strikes me of how relevant these issues are today. And so just this week, I know not everyone listened to this at the same time, but just before we did this recording, there were arguments before the United States Supreme Court on one of the abortion cases. And there's a lot of discussion about how Roe v. Wade may be on the way out and what might that mean and how are people going to think about issues. And one of the interesting things that happened there is the attorneys, I think this was for the Mississippi law that in essence bans abortions after a particular point of viability. There was a discussion between the attorneys for Mississippi and Justice Sotomayor. And Justice Sotomayor, she made the accusation that what the Mississippi statute was doing was bringing religion in a way that would be improper. And her question, she challenged the lawyer for the state of Mississippi and said, aren't we really just talking about religious concepts here? Isn't it at the very core of religion to determine when life begins? And isn't that essentially a religious question that we shouldn't be dealing with here and that's improper for us to deal with here? And I think actually, excuse me, it's good that she asked those questions, but it does reflect this idea that you can have religious questions versus scientific questions. And I thought the Mississippi lawyers missed a good opportunity, I think, to bring in some of the concepts that we've talked about, Now, maybe they haven't thought about some of those things. And instead, that lawyer tried to tie in things related to viability and the science behind what we know about when a fetus can survive outside the womb, if it leaves the womb early, those kinds of things, and ignored the religious versus science question by simply trying to appeal to science. Now, it's interesting because I think, by the way, even for those who profess to be believing in science, I think there are some really good arguments from that worldview as to why abortion should not be widely legal, especially at certain points after viability and maybe even immediately prior to viability. But I thought the Mississippi lawyer missed an opportunity to talk about the fact that, of course, questions of when life begins are essentially religious in nature, or at least religious and moral in nature, but so are so many of the questions that courts deal with. That courts don't make decisions merely on the basis of the scientific method. And to make a god of the scientific method is, in essence, to impose a particular religion upon the way that courts are going to think. And if we're going to be serious about not establishing, then perhaps we shouldn't be establishing science as religion either, or particular ways of thinking about scientific methods. So it's just really interesting how a lot of these concepts are very much at play in very important issues that are being dealt with right now and are even being talked about in the news, although not always with a lot of understanding of some of the philosophical concepts that are going on behind it.
I love the positioning on that. You and I are not seeking to be partisan ugly about this. Really, we're not. But I think we have a mirror to hold up to modern and postmodern ideas of science, of knowledge, of belief. And looking at these medieval thinkers in their theistic conceptions is going to be holding a mirror up and showing someone who hasn't perhaps seen themselves in that mirror, maybe just it's going to provide that perspective that helps them realize there's something more here. And maybe when I've been railing against theism and religion, maybe I've only been railing against someone else's God and someone else's religion as opposed to my own. That's the real danger. And that's the dialogue I'm hoping that this discussion will bootstrap. So, Chuck, thank you for bringing us through this introduction here. And we'll just continue in with it. It's great to see Pasnau, his area that we're finally getting to. I wondered when he was going to fit into this. Now that we've laid the groundwork, we've got a lot of material to cover in the medieval period itself. So we'll try to do that again in the next episode.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. This is really good material, and as we keep pointing out, it's really relevant today. So I'm glad we're working through it.